Shabbat Shalom and good morning. Today has the potential to be a historic day, not just because we celebrated a wonderful bar mitzvah, Asher, who we're incredibly proud of, but today, sitting on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral in Florida, is the Artemis 1 rocket, fueling up for its second attempt to reach the moon, beginning the auspicious project to build a lunar base, and then perhaps another mission to Mars. As Jews, we are taught to reach for the stars and to always strive to elevate ourselves. Maybe not quite to the point of zero gravity. We believe in the importance of also being grounded. But as the plans begin to inhabit the moon, our Parshat Shoftim, seems to be the perfect guidebook for building a society, with its laying out of a leadership structure of judges, officers, and officials, of priests and prophets, of scholars and of kings, of checks and balances. And as we continue in our own personal work this month, the month of Elul, preparing for the high holidays, the days preceding Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we are instructed to examine ourselves, our actions and our interactions, our words and our commitments, our promises from the past year, in order to launch into the new year onto a better path, to reach to new heights as the countdown to our high holidays tick down, T-minus 22 days. Our Torah portion, Shoftim, helps us to focus us, to launch us, and to ground us with the themes of tzedek, justice, as our bar mitzvah Asher taught us, of chesed and compassion, of shalom, peace and partnership, and of Torah, of learning, of self-reflection, and of growth, reminding us that we each have the power to transform and change, to launch a new mission, to improve our own lives and that of the world. As Asher described in our Torah portion, a focus is the laws of the king, the Jewish king or the Israelite king. Of course, we don't have a king today, but for many, many generations in the time of the Bible, there was an Israelite monarchy, there was a king. Interestingly, in our parsha, where we learn the laws of the king, the focus is not on what a king should do, but what a king shouldn't do. Not what a leader should do, but what a leader shouldn't do. Potentially sounding familiar. As Asher taught us, the Torah says that a king should not have too many horses. For if a king had too many horses, that means the king would have many chariots, and a king would be focused on growing their military prowess, with a focus on war and conquest. And in war, perhaps a king will feel self-sufficient and not have to rely on God's help. The next instruction is that a king should not send one's people back down to Egypt, where horses are bred, because going back down to Egypt symbolizes a return to a point in our history where we were slaves, spiritually empty, lacking direction. A king should not have too many wives, lest their heart go astray. One wife is plenty, thank God. In reality, in history, kings often married for military alliances. So why this prohibition of not too many wives? Perhaps the rabbis say that the king should be focused on loyalty to their own people, to within their own society and their community, and also perhaps that if a king had too many wives, they would focus, their mind would be somewhere else, and that we should avoid distraction. We should have focus on the most important values and priorities and principles in our lives. Of course, for a king, that would be taking care of a king's people. And the same for us, taking care of our community. The last negative instruction in our portion is that a king should not amass silver and gold to excess. Like horses, there is a danger in wealth that the king will have the illusion that they are invincible and self-sufficient, focused on personal greed, and not the need of taking care of other people. These are the temptations that the Torah lays out that a king and a leader could see the vulnerabilities to focus too much on their personal gain, power, and prowess. But of course, the rabbis say, just like royalty, we can certainly make good use of wealth and strength and power when we commit them to higher purposes. So what is the one thing that the Torah says that a king should do in our parsha? Asher taught it to us. When a king is seated on their throne, the king shall have a copy of a Sefer Torah written for the king. And that Torah should remain with the king every single day, day and night. Literally, the king should carry a Torah around with him wherever the king goes. The Torah should always be with it. And the Torah says so that the king will not be arrogant and the king will take care of the people. A king is required to be humble, which isn't easy when everyone bows before you and follows your word without question. The king is commanded to study the Torah constantly because good leaders are learners, learning in order to see clearer and further. A good king learns and teaches others to grow with them. A great message not just for leaders, but for each of us as we prepare for the new year. Just like the king in our parsha, we are also commanded to write for ourselves a Sefer Torah, a copy of our own Torah scroll. We read that later in the book of Deuteronomy, that we are each obligated to write a Sefer Torah. In fact, how many commandments are there in the Torah? 613, and number 613, the last one. And if you know, in tradition, we say it's not last is least. We actually always say, Acharon, Acharon, Chaviv, that last is best. The 613th commandment in the Torah, the last, the ultimate commandment is to write for yourselves a Sefer Torah, to write your own Torah scroll. The words in the Torah are, Kitvu lachem et ashira hazot, that every Jew should write for yourself a song. Song here is understood as Torah. We should sing it and it should be beautiful. And teach it to your children and place it in their mouths. Well, guess what? Tomorrow morning, right here, we will be dedicating a new Torah scroll by the Gottlieb family in memory of two very special members of our congregation, pillars of our congregation, Saul and Bernice Gottlieb of blessed memory. Saul was a Holocaust survivor. His incredible wife, Bernice, someone who lived by the values of chesed, of compassion and kindness. They were a couple and family that exemplified what it meant to live a life dedicated to Torah, the highest ideals and values, and commitment to community. This is a very special moment for our congregation. The last time we had a new Torah written was more than 25 years ago, and it will sit in our ark right here in the Moskowitz Sanctuary next to our Holocaust scroll, the scroll that survived the Shoah that is more than 500 years old. So what does it mean when we are instructed that we have to write for ourselves a Sefer Torah? The 613th commandment is not just incumbent upon a king, but on each and every one of us, that we need to continue to pass down the tradition, the words of God, to study and follow its ways, to live a life of our tradition by the values that are focused in our parsha today, of tzedek, of justice, of chesed, of kindness, of shalom, of peace and partnership, and Torah, learning, growth, self-reflection, and transformation. So how can, if I said the obligation is on each one of us to write a Sefer Torah, how many of you have done it so far in your lifetime? How many of you have actually written a Torah? Right, so if that, we got a few back there, a few of our young people, right? How can we fulfill this obligation? So the rabbis say we can do it in three ways. Number one is that we can learn to be a sofer ourselves. We can literally become a scribe. It takes years of study to do this, and actually write our own Sefer Torah. If you know, it takes a year for a scribe to write one Torah. So are we going to dedicate an entire year after the time that it takes to study in order to literally write a Sefer Torah? Each of the 300,000 letters perfectly and beautifully. The second way that we can do it is by commissioning a scribe to write a Sefer Torah on our behalf in memory of a loved one, or perhaps have the opportunity to pay as a community our last Torah. Different members of our community they dedicated a letter, a verse, a chapter, a parsha, a book of the Torah, and in that way we each had the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah. Or perhaps you have the opportunity to literally write in a letter of the Torah with the scribe. But the rabbis say that there is a third way that we can write a Sefer Torah, and that is if we live life in such a way that our life is like a Torah scroll, by living by the highest values of our tradition as a model, an example for others to follow, by sharing a love of Judaism that's passed down for generations to come. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory wrote this, quote, "Every Jew has to write their own scroll because the point about the Torah is not that it is old, but that it is indeed new. It's not just about the past, but it's also about the future. It's not simply some ancient document that comes from an earlier era in the evolution of society, but Torah and the scroll speaks to us now, but not without our own making an effort to write it once again. We have a call to write the next chapter of our lives," he writes, "to continue our people's journey so that we cannot be a missing letter from the Torah scroll." As we begin that T-22, our own personal preparation for the new year, Rosh Hashanah is only 3 weeks away. We know that our lives are like a book or a scroll, and that this is the time to write our story, or perhaps rewrite our story, so that we can learn from our successes from the past year and our failures, the lessons that we have learned from living life sometimes right, and sometimes perhaps we have to rewrite our story. How can we dedicate the next 3 weeks, the next year, the rest of our lifetime, so that we can take that feather, that quill, upon our own hearts and our own lives, so that we can write the next chapter, write those letters in the scroll that we will pass on to our families, to our children and grandchildren, to those around us in our community, so that they can live on like a legacy, like our new scroll. May we begin the writing process for the new year this week, so that we can all be inscribed for good, for growth, for kindness, justice, and peace in the year to come. Shabbat Shalom. We'll rise now as Cantor Rosenbaum leads us in the Musaf service.